She didn't find out the way you might expect. There was no dramatic confrontation, no stranger knocking at the door, no police officer standing on the front porch with bad news and a badge. What broke Rachel Calloway's life apart was a single phone call, quiet, brief, almost politely
No, it
delivered,
can't be true.
from a woman she had
I
never heard
can't
of,
believe this.
who opened the
This
conversation
is too
with
much.
6 words that Rachel would spend the next decade trying to unhear. 6 words that made the last 6 years of her life fold in on themselves. Like a house made of wet paper. She was standing in the kitchen of the home she shared with Gerald Mercer when her cell phone rang. She almost didn't answer it. And by the time she understood the truth, she had already given him everything. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Rachel Calloway was 24 years old when she met Gerald Mercer, and she was 30 years old when she found out who he really was. 6 years. 6 years of her life poured, completely and without reservation, into a man who had constructed himself the way an architect constructs a building, deliberately, precisely, with every detail considered and every potential weakness reinforced before anyone could find it. 6 years of mornings and arguments and compromises and dinners and dreams and quiet evenings on the couch that she had taken for real. And Gerald Mercer was 44 when they met, 20 years older, a gap that people remarked on, that her friends had concerns about, that her mother brought up more than once, in that careful way mothers bring things up when they're afraid of being ignored. But Rachel had seen what Gerald showed her, and what Gerald showed her was everything she had ever wanted to see. To understand what this story is really about, you have to understand who Rachel Calloway was before Gerald ever entered the picture. Because this is not a story about a woman who was careless with her trust. This is not a story about naivety or ignorance or desperation. Rachel was a first-generation college graduate who had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, in a household where her mother, Linda, worked 2 jobs and stretched every dollar and raised Rachel and her younger brother, Kevin, largely alone after their father drifted out of the picture when Rachel was 11. Not explosively, not dramatically, just gradually, and then completely. Rachel watched her mother absorb that absence with a kind of quiet dignity that left a permanent mark on her. She grew up understanding that stability was not something that arrived on its own. You had to build it. You had to earn it. And she was determined to do exactly that. She was a disciplined student, the kind who stayed in the library when everyone else was at the party. Not because she didn't want to be at the party, but because she had made a promise to herself about what her life was going to look like, and she intended to keep it. She got into Ohio State on partial scholarship, covered the rest with a part-time job at an off-campus coffee shop, and graduated at 22 with a business administration degree and a level of self-possession that made people who met her assume she had grown up with considerably more than she had. She moved to Columbus after graduation, got an entry-level position at a marketing firm, made a small circle of close, loyal friends. She had a plan. She had direction. The one thing she had not yet figured out was love. And she was, quietly, a deeply romantic person who believed that when it came, it would feel like recognition, like finding something you hadn't known was missing. She met Gerald Mercer in the spring, at a professional networking event in downtown Columbus. One of those events in the glass-walled upper floor of a building you only enter on occasions like this. White wine, catered appetizers, business cards exchanged with handshakes slightly too firm. Gerald was there as a representative of his commercial real estate consulting firm. Rachel was there because her manager had told her to go. And Rachel was the kind of person who showed up. They ended up near the same window, both slightly apart from the crowd. And Gerald said something dry and low about the food that made Rachel laugh. Not a polite laugh, a real one. He asked for her number before the evening was over. He waited 4 days to use it, and when he called, the conversation lasted 2 hours. On their first dinner the following week, he referenced something small she had mentioned in passing on the phone, a detail most people would have forgotten. Rachel noticed. She was meant to notice. It would take her years to understand that remembering details was not warmth. It was method. Gerald Mercer was, by every visible measure, exactly what he appeared to be. He was a tall man with silver at his temples and laugh, lines around his eyes, and the kind of presence that fills a room without announcing itself. He had lived in Columbus for 11 years. His commercial real estate consulting firm had a real address, real clients, a real reputation in local business circles. He sat on the board of a nonprofit that supported veterans' housing initiatives. He attended a Presbyterian church on the east side of town where the people who knew him nodded to him with respect. He drove a late model Lexus. He owned a four-bedroom house in a neighborhood with mature trees and well-kept lawns. He had been married once. He told people, briefly, in his early 30s, and it had ended amicably. No children. He was, in the language that his community would have used without hesitation, a good man, a settled man, the kind of man you could trust your daughter with, if your daughter was old enough to make her own choices. Rachel's closest friend, Diana Park, was 29 years old and worked as a paralegal in Columbus.
Good morning, everyone.
And Diana had a gift for
Morning.
reading people
Hey,
that
good to see you.
Rachel had always admired and occasionally resented. Diana did not say she liked Gerald. She said she would need more time. She said the age gap was significant. She said that men who had everything together, the way Gerald appeared to have, everything together sometimes had it together, because they had spent a lot of time practicing the performance. Rachel heard her. She considered it. And then she thought about the way Gerald looked at her when she talked. The way he made her feel not just attractive, but genuinely interesting. The way the house that had always felt like a thing she was building alone suddenly felt like something she might not have to build alone after all. She chose Gerald. Most people in her position would have made the same choice. Because Gerald Mercer was very, very good at making himself the obvious choice. The first year of their relationship was, by Rachel's own later account, the best year of her adult life. Gerald was present in the way that matters, not just physically available, but emotionally engaged, asking the right questions, remembering the answers. He took her to dinner at restaurants that required reservations weeks in advance, and then pretended it was nothing special. He introduced her to his friends, a circle of professionally successful people who welcomed Rachel warmly and seemed genuinely delighted by her. He told her she was exceptional. He told her that meeting her had reminded him what it felt like to look forward to things. He told her, 9 months in, that he loved her, and he did it not in a grand gesture, but quietly. In the car, after an ordinary evening. In the kind of moment that feels more real than the planned ones. Rachel said it back. She meant it with everything she had. She moved into Gerald's house 18 months after they met. It was a natural progression, at least from the outside. Gerald had encouraged it. He had been the one to suggest it. In fact, framing it as the obvious next step, the logical expression of where they were headed together. Rachel had her own reservations about moving at that pace. But Gerald had a way of making her reservations feel like fear rather than wisdom. And she had spent most of her life trying not to let fear make decisions for her. So she packed up her apartment, the one she had worked hard to furnish on her own modest salary. And she moved into Gerald's house on a Saturday in October, and Diana helped her carry boxes and said nothing critical because Diana understood that Rachel had already made the decision, and that the kindest thing a friend can do at that point is show up with her truck and help with the heavy lifting. Living together revealed Gerald in increments. Not dramatically, not in a way that set off obvious alarms. But Rachel began to see the architecture of his life more clearly, and some of what she saw she filed away in that quiet part of herself where she kept the things she wasn't sure what to do with. Gerald was protective of his phone in a way that she initially attributed to professional confidentiality. He handled a lot of sensitive business matters. He explained, and discretion was a professional obligation. He had a room on the second floor that he used as a home office and kept locked when he was not in it, which he explained away with references to confidential client documents. He sometimes left for what he called work, dinners, and came home later than he'd predicted, and the explanations were always reasonable, always slightly more detailed than they needed to be, which Rachel had not yet learned to recognize as a warning sign. Reasonable people give brief explanations. People who are rehearsing give long ones. There were other things, small things that don't seem like anything until you look back at all of them together and suddenly cannot believe how long it took to see the shape they made. Gerald never wanted to talk about his first marriage in detail. He deflected those conversations with such practiced ease that Rachel didn't always register that she was being deflected. His ex-wife, he said, was a private person who deserved her privacy. And wasn't it better to leave the past in the past? Rachel agreed. She thought it was mature. She thought it was considerate. She thought it spoke well of him. That he wasn't the kind of man who spoke poorly of a former partner. She would later understand that a man who has constructed a particular version of his history needs that history to stay vague. Specificity creates records. Vagueness leaves no trail. It was in the third year of their living together that Rachel first found something she couldn't explain away. It was not dramatic. It was not a smoking gun or a hidden phone or a stack of love letters. It was a piece of mail that she found in a stack of papers on the kitchen counter. A piece of mail from a utility company in a city she and Gerald had never discussed. Addressed to Gerald, but at a street address she did not recognize. She almost didn't pick it up. She almost just set it aside the way you set aside mail that belongs to someone else. But something made her look at it. Something made her turn it over and look at the return address again. She set it back down on the counter. She made dinner. She did not mention it that evening, but she did not forget it either. And that night, for the first time, she lay awake next to Gerald and felt something she had never felt in that bed before. A coldness, a distance, not between them, but inside herself. Something that had shifted and was not going back. She mentioned the piece of mail the following day. Casually, carefully, the way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. Gerald barely paused. He said it was a billing address for a property his firm managed, an investment property that he rented out for additional income and that he kept financially separate from his primary accounts because his accountant had advised him to maintain clean separation between business and personal assets. It was entirely plausible. It was the kind of thing that made complete sense if you already trusted the person saying it. Rachel told herself she trusted Gerald. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself that the explanation was reasonable, which it was. It was perfectly, carefully, completely reasonable. She picked up the dinner plates and washed them and did not allow herself to think about it again for several weeks. But the coldness had not gone away. Diana noticed the change in Rachel before Rachel could fully articulate what the change was. That is what the closest friendships are for. They function as a kind of mirror that reflects things back at you before you're ready to see them yourself. They were having coffee one afternoon when Diana asked, directly and without preamble, whether everything was all right at home. Rachel gave the answer that people give when they are not yet ready to say the real answer. She said things were fine. She said Gerald was Gerald. She said she was just tired from work. Diana looked at her for a moment and then said something Rachel never forgot. She said, "Rachel, I've been your friend for 7 years, and I've never heard you describe him the way you describe him now. You used to light up when you talked about him. Now you just talk about him." Rachel did not respond to that immediately. She picked up her coffee cup, and she changed the subject. But she thought about what Diana had said for a very long time afterward. It was 4 months after that conversation that Rachel found the second thing. This one was harder to explain away. She was looking for a folder of documents in Gerald's home office. He had left the door unlocked for once, and she needed a copy of their shared homeowner's insurance policy for an unrelated errand. And while she was searching through the filing cabinet, her hand landed on a folder she had never seen before. It was not labeled. It was tucked at the very back of the bottom drawer, behind a collection of folders that were all clearly labeled and clearly about the business. She pulled it out. She opened it. Inside was a collection of documents, bank statements. It appeared from an account she had never seen before. Not one of Gerald's business accounts. Not their joint household account. A personal account in Gerald's name, connected to a bank branch in Louisville, Kentucky. An account that had been active for at least 4 years, with regular monthly deposits, and with withdrawals that corresponded to expenses she could not identify with anything in their shared life together. She stood in the office with the folder in her hands for a long time. She did not hear Gerald come home. She heard the door open downstairs, and she heard him call her name. And she stood very still in that office for a moment, holding those bank statements. And then she closed the folder, put it back where she had found it, and walked out of the office and down the stairs, and said hello to Gerald as if nothing had happened. She cooked dinner. She sat across from him at the table. She watched him talk, and she thought, "How long have you been doing this?" She did not ask him yet. She was not ready to ask him yet, because she understood, in a way she could not fully articulate even to herself. That once she asked the question, whatever answer came back was going to be something she would have to live with. And she was still, even then, hoping to be wrong. She called Diana the next morning, early, while Gerald was still asleep. She did not tell Diana about the bank statements. She asked Diana something different. She asked Diana how you would go about finding out whether someone owned property in another state. And Diana, who was a paralegal and understood how to navigate public records, did not ask Rachel why she wanted to know. She just said, "Give me a few days." 2 days later, Diana sent Rachel a text message with a single question mark and an address. An address in Louisville, Kentucky. A property registered in Gerald Mercer's name. A property that Gerald had never mentioned, not once, in 6 years. Not in passing. Not in any conversation. Not when they had discussed finances. Not when they had discussed the future. Not when Rachel had asked, more than once. When they were planning what assets they were each bringing into the life they were supposedly building together. A property in Louisville, Kentucky, owned for at least 5 years. Rachel sat with that information for 3 days before she decided what to do with it. She hired a private investigator. His name was Marcus Webb, a former law enforcement officer, working out of Columbus who had been recommended to Diana through a contact at the law firm where she worked. Rachel met Marcus at a diner on a Tuesday morning, and she sat across from him and explained what she knew and what she suspected, and what she was afraid to find out. And Marcus listened without interrupting and then said something that she would later describe as the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. He said, "The fact that you're here usually means you already know the answer. You're just looking for someone to help you get to the documentation so that you can trust what you know." Rachel nodded. She wrote him a check. She drove home, and she began the longest 2 weeks of her life. Marcus came back to Rachel on a Thursday afternoon, 16 days after she'd hired him. He asked her to meet him in person. He said he wanted to walk her through what he had found, and he wanted to do it face to face, because some of what he had found was significant, and he did not want her to receive it alone. Rachel met him at the same diner. She ordered coffee she did not drink, and Marcus placed a folder on the table in front of her and said, before she opened it, that she should take a breath, that whatever she was bracing for, the reality was going to be different, not necessarily worse, not necessarily better, but different. Rachel opened the folder, and what she found inside reorganized everything she thought she knew about the last 6 years of her life. The property in Louisville was real. The bank account was real. But neither of those was the part that Marcus had asked her to sit down for. The part that Marcus had asked her to sit down for was the name. A woman's name, connected to the Louisville property, connected to a legal record that was still, as of that Thursday afternoon, fully active. Her name was Carol. Carol and Watkins Mercer. And according to the legal records that Marcus had obtained through entirely legitimate public document searches, Carol and Watkins Mercer had been married to Gerald Mercer for 14 years. Not divorced from Gerald Mercer. Not separated from Gerald Mercer. Married, legally, continuously, for 14 years. Which meant that for every single day of the 6 years Rachel had spent with Gerald, for every dinner and every vacation and every conversation about the future and every moment she had believed herself to be the woman in Gerald Mercer's life, Carol had existed. A wife. In Louisville, Kentucky. In a house that Gerald owned. A house that Gerald maintained. A house that Gerald visited when he was, according to the explanations he had been giving Rachel for years, away for work. Not every trip. Not every absence. But enough. For 14 years. Rachel sat in that diner booth for a very long time after Marcus closed the folder. She did not cry. She has described that moment as a kind of stillness that goes beyond emotion, the place the mind goes when the information it has just received is too large to feel all at once. So it feels nothing at all and simply waits for the body to catch up. Marcus sat across from her and did not push her to speak. He got her a glass of water. He refilled her coffee. And when she finally looked up at him, the only thing she said was, how long did he think he could keep this going? And Marcus, who had spent 20 years in law enforcement and had seen the full range of what human beings were capable of, said, in my experience, men like Gerald Mercer don't think about when it ends. They're too focused on keeping it going. Rachel drove home alone. Gerald was there when she arrived, and she did not say a word. She spent a week in that house knowing what she knew. A week of sitting across from Gerald at dinner. A week of sleeping in the same bed. A week of watching him move through the shared spaces of a life that she now understood had been built, at least in part, on a structure that was never legally hers to begin with. She has described that week as the strangest of her life, not because she was pretending, but because she wasn't quite pretending either. She was processing. She was measuring. She was deciding, very carefully, what she was going to do next. Because Rachel Calloway was not a woman who acted without thinking. She was a woman who grew up learning that when the foundation of something shifts, you had better understand exactly what has shifted before you. Start trying to rebuild. She called her mother. She called Diana. She called an attorney. And then, on a Friday evening, when Gerald was sitting in the living room watching television, she walked in and sat down across from him and said, "I need you to tell me about Carol." The silence that followed that question was, by Rachel's description, the longest silence she had ever sat inside. It was not the silence of a man gathering his thoughts. It was the silence of a man who has spent years constructing a particular set of walls and who has just felt all of them shift simultaneously. Gerald's face did something she had never seen it do before. It went still. Not still the way it went still when he was thinking or listening. Still the way a performance goes still when the performer realizes the audience knows it's a performance. And then he spoke. And what he said was not a denial. What he said was a redirect. He said, "Rachel, I can explain all of this. And I want to, but I need you to. Listen to me with an open mind because this is more complicated than it looks." And Rachel looked at him, the man she had loved for 6 years, the man she had moved across the city for, the man she had restructured her entire life around. And she said, "Then start talking, because I have all night." What Gerald offered, over the next 2 hours, was not a confession. It was a negotiation. He admitted that Carol existed. He admitted that the legal marriage had not been formally dissolved when he met Rachel. He offered explanations that were detailed and plausible and layered, with just enough truth to be disorienting. He and Carol had been estranged for years, he said. The marriage existed on paper only. They had been in the process of a complex separation that had been delayed repeatedly for reasons involving Carol's health and shared property arrangements. He had not told Rachel because he had not wanted the legal technicality of a paper marriage to damage something real and genuine, which was what he and Rachel had. He had intended to resolve it. He had been on the verge of resolving it multiple times. He loved Rachel. Everything between them was real. Carol was a formality, a complication, a piece of paperwork he had been mishandling out of avoidance and not out of malice. He was sorry. He was genuinely, deeply sorry. And he looked at Rachel with the same eyes that had once made her feel like the most interesting person in any room. And he asked her not to walk away. Rachel listened to every word. She did not interrupt. And when he finished, she asked him one question. She asked him whether Carol knew that he and Rachel existed. Gerald's answer to that question was a pause that lasted approximately 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, without a single word being spoken, Rachel received the most honest communication Gerald Mercer had offered her in 6 years. Because the answer was no. Carol did not know. Which meant that Carol, somewhere in Louisville, Kentucky, in a house that Gerald paid for, with a legal marriage that Gerald had maintained, was also living a version of a life that Gerald had built and was sustaining and had chosen, for reasons she could not yet fully comprehend, to keep intact. There were not one woman being deceived in this story. There were two. What Rachel did not yet know, what Marcus had not yet fully uncovered, and what would only emerge in the weeks that followed as attorneys and investigators began pulling at threads, was that the deception was older and wider than even the 14 years of Carol's marriage. Gerald Mercer had a pattern, not a pattern he had developed with Rachel or even with Carol, a pattern that went back further, that involved other women, other arrangements, other instances of carefully managed financial entanglement with people who trusted him. Marcus found a woman in Cincinnati, call her Brenda, who had been in a relationship with Gerald for 3 years in the early 2000s, before Carol had become the primary arrangement. Brenda had invested money in one of Gerald's business ventures, a significant amount of money. The venture had dissolved and the money had not come back, and Brenda had written it off as a failed investment and a painful relationship and had moved on with her life. She had never connected it to fraud because Gerald had been so careful. He always was. The genius of what Gerald did was that it never looked like what it was. The Louisville property, it emerged, was not simply Gerald's second home. It was a financial instrument in a complex arrangement that Gerald had been maintaining across 2 states for years, an arrangement that involved Carol's inheritance money, which Gerald had access to through joint accounts established early in their marriage, and which had been used in ways that Carol's own attorney, once alerted, described as deeply problematic. Gerald had been managing money that was not his to manage. He had been making financial decisions about assets that belonged to Carol, and sometimes to Rachel through their shared household arrangements that benefited neither woman, but served the maintenance of a dual life that required significant ongoing resources to sustain. 2 households, 2 sets of bills, 2 sets of expectations to manage. 2 women who both believed they were in real, committed, exclusive relationships with a man who was, in the most technical legal sense, only married to one of them, and who was, in the only honest sense, not genuinely present with either. It was Diana who first made contact with Carol. Rachel had not asked her to, but Diana, who is a paralegal and understands that information shared between connected parties can serve as both protection and documentation, reached out through a carefully worded letter to a post office address associated with the Louisville property. Carol received that letter on a Wednesday. She called Rachel's number, which Diana had included, on a Thursday, and Rachel, who had been waiting for this call without quite knowing she was waiting for it, answered on the second ring. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Neither woman cried during it, at least not out loud. Carol had had her own moments of unease over the years, her own questions, her own small discoveries that had been smoothed over by Gerald's explanations. She had chosen, as Rachel had chosen, to believe the man she loved because the alternative was a truth that restructured everything. But now the truth was on the phone with her, and there was nothing left to smooth over. Rachel's attorney filed the first legal documents within the week. What followed was not quick and it was not clean, but it was thorough. Gerald Mercer was served with notice of a civil action related to financial fraud and misappropriation of jointly held assets. A separate investigation was opened by authorities in Kentucky based on Carol's filing, which raised questions about the handling of her inheritance funds. Gerald's firm, which had given him the professional legitimacy that made all of this possible, was examined for irregularities. Some were found. Gerald's response to all of it was consistent with everything Rachel had come to understand about him. He negotiated. He minimized. He reframed. He positioned himself as a man who had made significant mistakes out of avoidance and emotional cowardice, rather than deliberate fraud. He had an attorney who was good at helping people present themselves this way. But the documentation Marcus had assembled, and the documentation that Carol's attorney contributed, and the documentation that emerged from the examination of Gerald's firm told a story that negotiation and reframing could not fully contain. Gerald Mercer was ultimately charged with bigamy under Ohio law, a charge that carries serious consequences in a state that treats undisclosed concurrent marriage as a fourth-degree felony. He faced additional civil liability related to the financial arrangements, not all of which rose to the level of criminal fraud under the specific legal thresholds required, that materially affected his assets. His nonprofit board seat was quietly vacated. His professional reputation, the thing he had spent 11 years constructing in Columbus with the care of someone who understood that reputation, was the primary currency of his particular kind of deception, was finished. The people who had nodded to him with respect in the church parking lot now had to reckon with the distance between who they thought he was and who the court documents said he had been. That reckoning was, by all accounts, uncomfortable for everyone involved. Gerald had been very good at making people believe in him. The community that had believed hardest had the furthest to fall. What happened to Carol is important and deserves to be said clearly. Carol Watkins Mercer had spent 14 years married to a man who had used her legal commitment and her financial assets as the foundation of a parallel life she knew nothing about. She had raised herself, largely, in the portions of those years when Gerald was absent, and Gerald had been absent often, for reasons she had accepted as the cost of being married to a man whose work required him to travel. She was not a naive woman. She was a woman who had been systematically managed by someone with a great deal of experience in managing people. She cooperated fully with investigators. She filed her own civil action. She rebuilt. She has said publicly that the hardest part was not the betrayal itself, but the period of self-doubt that followed. The internal interrogation of every memory. The compulsive re-examination of every moment she had dismissed or explained away. The question of whether she should have known. The answer to that question, for anyone who has studied how men like Gerald operate, is no. You could not have known. That is the entire point of the architecture. Rachel's story does not end in the courtroom. That is where Gerald's story enters its legal chapter. But Rachel's story continues well past the verdict. In the months after the legal proceedings concluded, Rachel did something that she has described as both the most difficult and the most necessary thing she has ever done.
Our
She talked
stories of
about it,
resilience
not in a
connect
victim's
us.
framing,
By
not
sharing
presenting
them, we
herself
build
as someone to
strength
whom
together.
things happened, but as a woman who had survived something that required genuine courage to survive and who understood that her experience contained information that could be useful to other people. She spoke to a journalist. She agreed to be part of a panel discussion on financial abuse and relationship fraud hosted by a women's advocacy organization in Columbus. She helped Diana draft a resource guide for people who suspect they may be in financially entangled relationships with deceptive partners, and a practical document that lays out, step by step, what to look for and how to document what you find. She did not do any of this to punish Gerald. She did it because she understood, viscerally and completely, that the reason men like Gerald survive for as long as they do is that the women they affect are too ashamed or too devastated to talk about it. And Rachel had decided she was done being either of those things. She has said, in the years since, that the age gap was not the problem. 20 years between two people is not a structure that predicts deception. There are age gap relationships built on genuine love and total honesty. And there are same-age relationships that are catastrophic betrayals. The age gap in Rachel and Gerald's case was not the cause, but it was a condition that Gerald understood and used. He understood that a younger woman, however capable and intelligent, was more likely to defer to an older partner's framings of reality, more likely to accept his explanations as the explanations of someone with more experience of the world, more likely to attribute her own unease to inexperience, rather than to accurate perception. Gerald had, in the language Rachel now uses when she talks about this publicly, weaponized the credibility that age confers. He had used the 20-year gap not as a bridge, but as leverage. And understanding that, naming it clearly and without softening it, is part of how Rachel has taken back the narrative of her own life. Marcus Webb, the private investigator, has said in interviews that the case of Gerald Mercer was notable, not for its uniqueness, but for its completeness. Most cases of this kind involve elements of Gerald's story, but rarely all of them simultaneously. The age gap, the dual legal marriage, the cross-state financial arrangement, the carefully maintained professional reputation, the manipulation of a woman's trust over a period of years. What made Gerald unusual was the scope of his architecture. He had built a structure that was designed to sustain itself indefinitely, requiring constant maintenance, but almost no risk of collapse as long as the two sides of his life never became aware of each other. The failure point was simple and, in retrospect, almost inevitable. He had underestimated Rachel's instincts. He had attributed her unease to anxiety rather than to accurate perception. He had explained away one too many things one too many times. And he had done it to a woman who was beneath the love and the trust and the genuine investment she had made in their life together, paying attention. Rachel Calloway had always been paying attention. Gerald Mercer had simply counted on her not to act on what she noticed. There is a question that always comes up when a story like this one is told, and it is a question worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. The question is, how do you know? How do you know a relationship that feels real in a life that feels genuine? And the honest answer is that you often don't know, not with certainty, not with documentation, not with the kind of clarity that makes the decision to act feel straightforward rather than terrifying. What you have, in most cases, is a feeling, a shift in temperature, a moment of stillness in a bed you have shared for years, a piece of mail from a city you've never discussed, a question that doesn't quite get answered. These are not certainties. They are signals. And the critical thing, the thing that Rachel Calloway has said over and over in the years since, is that when you feel those signals, you do not owe anyone the benefit of the doubt at the cost of your own clarity. You are allowed to ask the question. You are allowed to look for the answer. You are allowed to trust what you notice. Gerald Mercer, at the time of the legal proceedings, offered one final statement that was reported in local coverage of the case. He said that he had never intended to hurt anyone. He said that the life he had built with Rachel had been real to him, that his feelings had been genuine even when his actions had not. He said that he understood the damage he had caused and that he was prepared to accept the consequences. Attorneys and psychologists who study this kind of long-term relational deception have a consistent response to statements like this one. They may be true, and they are also irrelevant. The internal experience of a person who constructs deception on this scale, whether he genuinely feels love, whether his emotions are real in some private sense, does not change what was taken. 6 years of a woman's life, 14 years of another woman's life, financial resources that belonged to both of them, the versions of the future they had each constructed around a man who was not available to either of them in the way they believed he was. Whatever Gerald felt, those things were taken, and no statement at sentencing gives them back. Rachel Calloway is in her mid-30s now. She is still in Columbus, in a city she chose for herself before Gerald and has chosen to remain in after him. She has rebuilt her finances, a process that was harder than she anticipated and took longer than she wanted. But that is now complete enough that she describes it without bitterness. She has rebuilt her social life. She has rebuilt, most importantly, her relationship with her own instincts, the part of herself that noticed things and, for a period of years, was persuaded to override what it noticed. She does not hate Gerald. She has said that clearly and repeatedly, and it seems to be true rather than performed. Hate, she has said, would require ongoing engagement with something she has decided to move past. What she has is clarity, a clear understanding of what happened, why it was possible, and what it cost her, and a commitment, expressed in the advocacy work, in the conversations she has with other women who reach out to her, in the public testimony she has offered, that the clarity she paid so much to acquire should be worth something to someone beyond herself. Carol Watkins Mercer relocated after the proceedings. She has been considerably more private about her story than Rachel has been, which is her right. She has said, in the one public statement she made, that she is grateful for the women who were willing to speak on the record, and that she hopes her silence is understood, not as shame, but as a preference for privacy that she has more than earned. She is living her life. She is, by all available accounts, doing so on terms that are entirely her own. Whatever Gerald Mercer expected his legacy to be, and a man like Gerald, who cared so deeply about his reputation, surely had some vision of his legacy, it is not this. It is not two women, separately, rebuilding the lives he complicated. It is not a courtroom, record, and a vacated board seat, and a community that once nodded to him with respect, now averting its eyes. Whatever he imagined, it was not this. It is very rarely what they imagine. Now I want to ask you something directly, because this is not just Rachel's story. This is not just Carol's story. Stories like this one happen in cities all across this country, to women who are not naive, who are not careless, who are not asking for anything, except what any person in a relationship has the right to ask for, which is honesty. They happen to women who pay attention and still get deceived, because the person doing the deceiving has had years of practice. They happen at every income level, in every profession, in every zip code. And they tend not to get told, not fully, not in the kind of detail that would actually be useful to someone who is right now in the early stages of noticing something she doesn't know what to do with. So if you are watching this and something in you recognized a detail in this story, not necessarily the bigamy, not necessarily the cross-state property, but something smaller, a piece of mail, a question that didn't quite get answered, a friend who said you used to light up and now you just talk. If any of that landed somewhere specific inside you, I want you to know that noticing is not paranoia. Noticing is the first act of taking care of yourself, and you are allowed to trust what you notice. If this story moved you in any way, leave a comment below. Tell us what part of it stayed with you. Tell us what you would have done if you were Rachel, standing in that home office with those bank statements in your hands. Tell us whether you think what Gerald received was justice. or whether justice in a case like this is even a thing the legal system is equipped to fully deliver. These are real questions that deserve real conversations. And this is the place for those conversations. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel, because the stories we tell here are stories that matter. Stories that contain real information about the world we actually live in. And we are not done telling them. In fact, the next story we have coming is one that will stay with you just as long as this one has. A case out of Tennessee that involves a secret that had been hiding, not in a second city, but in a second life, right in the same town. And the woman who finally cracked it open by doing something that nobody, including the man at the center of it, ever saw coming. That story is next. Don't miss it.